All right, so we're going to talk about human impact on the environment. So human activities can affect the quality and supply of renewable resources, such as land, forests, fisheries, air, and fresh water. But before I move on, who can tell me the difference between renewable and non-renewable resources? All right, go ahead, tell me. Okay, well, maybe not necessarily once, but
Well, it's
it
limited.
eventually runs out, right? Yes, it's limited. It
Well, I mean,
eventually
like,
runs.
our whole, you can't unburn.
I got it, okay, I see what you're saying. But it's limited and there is an end, whereas renewable,
Yeah.
okay, over and over again. All right. So there's what is known as sustainable development, and this is a way of using natural resources, okay, without depleting them and using them up. So some things that we've talked about would be like cycles. Okay, there's a reason for cycles: water cycle, okay, nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle. Okay, and also to provide for human needs without causing long-term environmental harm, because humans have a pretty big impact on the environment. So a major challenge of sustainable development is balancing the protection of ecosystems with the protection of human economic systems, okay? So we're balancing ecosystems and economic. So a lot throughout this PowerPoint, you're gonna see a lot of terms, big vocab terms. And the first one that we're gonna talk about is bioaccumulation. So things like pesticides, which we've talked about when we did antibiotic and pesticide resistance, okay? These are substances that are used to kill insects. So we see this a lot in North Carolina because it would be used in what industry? Farming, okay? So pest is something that's annoying, like an insect, a mosquito, okay? And acide means to kill, okay? So a great example of this is what is known as DDT. So pesticides can be absorbed into an organism's body, and they're passed on when organisms eat each other, okay? So we could see something like this in a food chain, okay? So bio means what? Life. And if you're accumulating something, what does that mean? Building up, okay? So bioaccumulation is when pesticides build up in an organism's body. So the most pesticides are going to accumulate in the highest trophic levels. Okay, so we've already talked about the food chain. So they are going to accumulate in your top predators, your apex predators, okay? So we start small, okay? We start at the producer level, and they are going to take in the pesticides. But as we move up the food chain, now the primary consumers, are they eating just one producer? No, okay, they're eating several. And then as we build up and move up, okay, organisms are also starting to increase in what? In size, okay? So they're not just eating one or two of the level below. So over time, it's accumulating and building up more and more and more. So that top predator or apex predator is where we're going to find the biggest accumulation. Okay, so we've already mentioned the word sustainability. So this can happen for a long time without running out and without problems. So this would be similar to what term that we mentioned? If it can happen for a long time and not run out, renewable, there you go, okay? So an example of this is wind energy, okay? So the wind carries energy, and turbines, like these windmills, anybody ever see a wind farm? Okay, they're pretty massive, okay? So the turbines can capture that wind. So then we can turn it into things like electricity and power. So the wind will never run out. Therefore, wind power also does not pollute the environment. And so it's going to last for a long, long time. The only thing is that wind power is super expensive, okay? Because when we build these wind farms, they're not quick, easy, and cheap, okay? So it only provides about 0.1% of our actual power. Okay, now we're going to get into the opposite, which is not sustainable. So that means it's going to run out or cause problems to use. So what term are we using here?
Non-renewable.
Non-renewable, okay? So an example of this is burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels include things like oil, coal, and natural gas. So 85% of our energy comes from burning fossil fuels. So we see this in things like factories, okay, driving around in our cars. So we only have a certain amount of fossil fuels, so eventually it's going to run out. Also, burning fossil fuels pollutes our environment and causes things like global warming. Because give me an example of a greenhouse gas that gets put on carbon dioxide, okay? So that CO2 gets put into the atmosphere, and that's what leads to global warming. Okay, another thing we need to be familiar with is ozone layer destruction. So we talked about this earlier. Okay, the ozone layer is a layer in the atmosphere with a high concentration of ozone gas, and it's used to absorb harmful UV rays from the sun. So CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, okay, they put holes in the ozone layer. And we find these in things like aerosol cans, okay? So think like a hairspray bottle, which nowadays they have definitely put changes to, okay? So these that used to cause this back in the day, okay, those are things that are banned now. So they've had to change, okay, different types of cans, aerosol cans, that you would find like hairspray in now.
So you can't use that anymore?
Not those, okay? So the thing we do need to know is that chlorofluorocarbons, though, are not greenhouse gases. So it is not CO2. It is not methane. Another term we need to be familiar with is acid rain, okay? This is caused by burning fossil fuels. So what happens is air pollutants mix with rain, and then it becomes acid rain, which is acidic, because those pollutants mixed with your everyday rain makes it acidic, and that is in turn what becomes acid rain. So it can build up in lakes, streams, and ponds, and it can kill off wildlife and fish. So think back to when we talked about dead zones, okay, and algae blooms. What happens in that situation? Who remembers? So what is no longer there? But why? What's lacking that they can't get? Right, okay? So that's what makes them become a dead zone. So if life does go there, they're not getting the oxygen that they need, and therefore they would die. Another term we need to be familiar with is deforestation, okay? So if we pull the word apart, D means down or away, and forest deals with trees, okay? So deforestation means we're cutting down trees. And deforestation can have a lot of negative impacts. One, it can lead to habitat loss, okay? A lot of plant and animal life are found in a forest, and therefore we cut down all these trees, we're taking away their habitat. Another big one is that with these trees being gone, what are we going to have excess of in the atmosphere now? Carbon dioxide, because those trees aren't there to take it in. So, exactly what I just said. So, deforestation can exacerbate climate change because trees do photosynthesis in order to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Okay, so when we cut those down, now we're going to have excess CO2 in the atmosphere, and now this makes, in turn, climate change much worse. Next, which I've already stated, trees give homes to animals. So when we cut them down, the animals now lose their homes and they can die. So in certain situations, animals can even become extinct if their habitats are taken away. So this takes us back to our food webs, okay? So if the grass was taken away, what would happen to the deer population? Okay, it would decrease because that is what? Their resource, that's their source of food, okay? What would happen to the mountain lions? They would also decrease because they rely on the what? On the deer. So remember when we talked about food chains and food webs, especially food webs, we talked about if one thing is disrupted in that food web, it affects everything else, okay? So if the grass was taken away, what would happen to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere? It would increase, right? So it's just like deforestation. Another term we need to be familiar with is biodiversity. So bio means life. And when we talk about diverse or diversity, we're talking about different kinds, okay? So biodiversity is different kinds of life. So essentially the number of different species. So when human actions cause species to die, then we in turn lose biodiversity. So how do you think human actions might reduce biodiversity? We just talked about some. Okay. So when we cut down trees, lose habitats, we can lose biodiversity, we can lose life, pollution. Okay, so burning gas. Burning fossil fuels. All right, nicely done. All right, the next thing that we need to know is non-native species, okay, invasive species. So if something is non-native, that means that it doesn't normally live in that specific area, okay? So non-native species, if they're not from that area and they come in and take over, okay, they have no predators. So that allows their population to continually increase, okay? Because they have nothing necessarily to compete against, and they don't have any natural predators, okay? So when we introduce non-native species or invasive species, okay, they eventually take over an ecosystem and can kill off other species. A great example of this for North Carolina is kudzu. You ever heard of kudzu? It's a green vine. You can see it growing on houses and buildings.